My son did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. He's going after me because he knows if I get the nomination, I will beat him like a drum.
This is a crisis of Donald Trump's making, and it is on a long list of crises of Donald Trump's making, and that's why gotta go.
I don't need lessons from you on courage, political or personal.
Stakes were high, the stage crowded with a dozen candidates, and we heard some very sharp exchanges. The New York Times and CNN hosted a Democratic presidential debate in Ohio earlier this week. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. We'll take a deep dive on the debate in just a moment. Also on tap, Bill de Blasio not going to be president, but he is still mayor for more than 2 years. What should his agenda be for the city in that time? We'll talk about that. But let's begin with the Democratic candidates for president. They debated with Biden, Warren, Sanders, far ahead of the others in the polls, and with Elizabeth Warren slightly ahead of Biden in some of those polls. She became the target for attacks from more moderate rivals.
I will not sign a bill into law that does not lower costs for middle-class families.
No plan has been laid out to explain how a multi-trillion-dollar hole in this Medicare for All plan that Senator Warren is putting forward is supposed to get filled in.
At least Bernie's being honest here and saying how he's going to pay for this and that taxes are going to go up. And I'm sorry, Elizabeth, but you have not said that. And I think we owe it to the American people to tell them where we're going to send the invoice.
So what were the big takeaways from the debate? Who are the winners and losers, and any breakout moments for the candidates? Most important, did the debate do anything to shake up the race, allow a lagging candidate to move up? Christine Quinn, the former city council speaker, now vice chair of the New York State Democratic Party. Jonathan Ellis, a senior politics editor for the New York Times, and Johanna Barr is also a senior politics editor for the Times. We've had a couple of debates now, monthly debates. We're looking forward to yet another one in November. Have these debates made any difference whatsoever?
I mean, I think they have made a difference. Look, I think having many opportunities for Americans to look at presidential candidates is a good thing. More debates give more opportunity for more issues to be brought to the table. I think that is all good. I think it's been complicated because you've had like the top card and the low card debates, and then you put everybody on stage this week. So it's a challenge, but I think anything that can engage even one more American in the democratic process, particularly when we are trying to save it from Donald Trump, is a good thing.
What is the benefit to either the American public or the Democratic Party to have this way of picking a candidate? We're measuring so far on the basis of national polls, which maybe I'm wrong, I think are kind of meaningless because we need to know what's going on in the pivotal states. We're measuring on money, which may or may not be meaningful at this stage of the campaign. And we're measuring on debates, which I guess give us a sense of how the candidates would ultimately do against Donald Trump or whoever the Republican nominee is in a face-to-face debate. And I guess the question is that any way to pick a candidate?
I mean, part of it is the Democratic National Committee doesn't want to be seen as putting their thumb on the scale too much in this race, right? So they want to have as many debates as possible with essentially as many, viable candidates as possible in those debates so that the process appears to be fair. So that's part of it. But you're right, this is sort of a nationalized campaign, and yet it's going to be interesting to see what happens because you do have candidates like a Pete Buttigieg, who now have realized that they really do need to go all in on Iowa and really do some retail campaigning there and see if they can win people over there instead of just relying on national television.
Johanna?
I'll also point out, it feels like we've been paying attention to this race forever, but there are many polls that show that many Americans are just not tuned in quite yet, and they will, but it's still very early for a lot of people, and I think that the more opportunities they have to see who is running and who their options are, there's definitely an upside to that.
Is Joe Biden faltering in his campaign, or do the number of stories we write about that sort of make it self-fulfilling?
Well, look, I think, Joe Biden was the front runner before he entered, which can often be very dangerous territory. So I think the best day for Joe Biden's campaign, as in many campaigns, was the day before he announced. So he's not been able to pull the nose of that plane up since, day one. He had sharp attacks against him very early on, which he weathered, but not quite as dynamically as we expect from Uncle Joe. So he's had some problems that are front-runner problems, and he's had some problems of his own through his missteps and his, foot and mouth situation. Now, all of that said, if you pull the lens back, this is Joe Biden. He's kind of a jolly guy who likes to slap you on the back, who generally, has the four squares of all of the facts, but is a better storyteller than a fact revealer, who's been an outstanding leader in this country for his, entire lifetime. That part of who he is in totality hasn't really changed at all.
But what about the fact that the others seem to be gaining in the polls? Does that suggest that the voters, such as they are, Democratic voters who will pick in primary states, want someone who represents more of the future?
Well, I don't think Biden's numbers were where they were said to be at before he entered. Those were not real numbers. Right, because you're always kind of the guy or gal you don't have is the one you want.
Right.
So
or the one you know by name.
Exactly. So I don't think those numbers were real. Is Warren doing a good job catching up on him? Absolutely, and she deserves that credit. And a lot of people thought in the beginning her plan for a plan was not gonna. It was too minutia for voters. Good for voters. They said it wasn't too much, and they like somebody who actually heard what their problems are and has responded to them.
We hosted the debate with CNN. Why won't she answer the question about taxes? She says costs for health care will go down, but she won't say whether taxes will go up.
It's a really interesting situation that she's in with healthcare, because Bernie Sanders in the debate said, I will raise taxes to pay for Medicare for all, even though, no one will have to pay out of pocket for health coverage anymore. And Warren wouldn't answer that question, and I do wonder how she's going to approach that going forward. But I think right now she doesn't want to be caught in creating some kind of soundbite that can be used against her going forward. But how much longer is that position tenable? That's the big question.
Tough to dodge that question for forever.
But she's disciplined, which just as a former candidate, I have to say.
She would not take the bait.
And you hit the nail on the head. She doesn't want to give Donald Trump video footage to run in a commercial, if she ends up being the Democratic candidate.
Yeah, but you can't go a year without answering the question, can you?
How many days has Donald Trump's administration gone without a White House briefing? Apparently, it's a bold new place of what you can and can't do.
I wouldn't be surprised if her campaign looks at how this became such an attack, like a point of attack during the debate, and decides to maybe double down on coming up with a more specific plan. In the previous debate, she said, I'm with Bernie. It is an obvious gap. I mean, we don't know if voters really care about this as much as journalists appear to, but I wouldn't be surprised if they came out with something a bit more direct.
If Biden slips in the polls, do we hear any realistic rumblings of Mike Bloomberg getting into the race?
There's a little bit of rumbling this week. I think CNBC had a Bloomberg story, so it seems like he's sort of this spectral presence now that's sort of always there. Maybe he's going to see an opening and get in, but beyond the sort of occasional well-placed media story, it doesn't seem like there's anything.
Is it too late?
I mean, it's pretty late.
Tom Steyer didn't think it was too late, and that hasn't worked out too well for him.
Fair point.
Let's talk about impeachment and its impact. The House is going ahead full steam. Where does that leave us in terms of what they're finding, the fact that the White House is not having much effect in terms of keeping its witnesses away from the committee, and where that timetable will leave the Senate ultimately?
Well, look, I think the House is a little bit behind in their schedule, right? They wanted this wrapped up by October. I don't criticize from that. There's more and more they're finding out. And I think the House, particularly Speaker Pelosi's, doing a very good job of being clear, being methodical, and not like getting distracted by a Donald Trump shiny new thing of the day. I think that's good, and I think they're building the case. I have little hope at the moment that the Senate will do a thoughtful trial or a fair trial. But the House is doing, and which is ultimately what we need, but the House is doing such a good job, I think, in spelling out all the facts, and Chair Schiff doing a great job, that I think that's going to make a big impact even on the race, on the American public's opinion. And remember, right now we're over 50% of Americans who support the impeachment process. If you compare that again back to Watergate, we're further ahead than people were as it related to Nixon then. So I think the pro-impeachment, the Democrats have a very strong hand right now, which makes the potential of a biased trial in the Senate harder and harder for the Republicans to pull off.
But in Watergate, the sitting president, cared about his party, cared about the country. Here, arguably, we're in a different situation.
Fair point.
So what happens when the House votes to impeach, if it does, the Senate doesn't convict, and the president says, I'm in the clear, and now let's deal with the real issues?
And that'll be a question, I guess, if that sequence of events were to happen, I guess that'll be a question as to how that impacts the 2020 campaign. But of course, I've heard some historians say recently that maybe Nixon should have just hung on. So we'll see, what path Trump goes down from here.
And I don't think Trump will be in the clear. I think Speaker Pelosi and Chair Schiff are doing such a good job that even if he doesn't get convicted by the Senate, he won't be in the clear, and that'll become a really strong issue in the election in general.
Mick Mulvaney admitting this week
Yes.
that there was some quid pro quo in withholding the funds from Ukraine pending, the investigation of Trump's enemies. What is that about? Is that calculated? Is that stupid? Explain that to me as best we can.
I mean, look, there's certainly something to the Trump system of how Trump and his administration work in terms of putting things out in the open, and by doing so, that makes things less objectionable, right? I mean, we always say, people always say it's more about the cover-up than the crime. Well, if you put what you're doing out in the open, that may sort of move the window of acceptability on that thing, and I think that's sort of how Trump has often conducted himself and his administration as well.
Joanna, I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, 2 weeks ago when he stood on the lawn and he said that China should investigate, I mean, everyone seems to have moved on from that. I'm not saying that that's correct, but it's like you just said, you do it in public. And
The Turks have agreed to a ceasefire. Is Syria going to hurt him? It seems to have certainly lost him some support among Republicans for the first time. What do you think?
I mean, it's true. People seem very upset about it. The letter that he put out where he said, we'll make a deal, call me. I mean,
I'll call you later.
I'll call you later. It's unlike anything that we've ever seen.
I mean, it was interesting to hear Nancy Pelosi this week basically say, she thought Trump was rattled because you had 2/3 of the House Republicans, voting to condemn his actions. So that's certainly a new scenario that he's facing.
And Americans do not like the idea of abandoning allies, right? America could not be America if it had not been for allies at many, many points in our history. Americans don't like that. Americans don't like seeing dead children being held in the hands of their mothers, and dead simply because of who they are, the Kurds. So I think this is significant on a different level. Yes, because Republicans spoke out, right, and voted as they should have. But it goes against kind of core America, that we stand by our allies, that we stand strong, that we're the leader of democracy. And we don't see much of that in Donald Trump, but this was a total abandonment of core American values, and that's going to stick with him.
Thanks to Johanna Barr and to Jonathan Ellis for joining us, and Christine Quinn will stick around. We'll talk about Bill de Blasio's presidential dreams and what he's got left to do as mayor. Bill de Blasio's anemic run for president is over. His time as mayor is not. He has more than 2 years left in his term, and he doesn't have a deep reservoir of goodwill in the city to work with. Many New Yorkers think he doesn't much like being mayor. They don't like that, or like him for that matter. A poll by Siena College found de Blasio with a 33% favorable rating among city voters and a 58% unfavorable rating. But there are plenty of problems he could work on in the next 2 years. There are almost 80,000 homeless people in the city, some of whom sleep on the streets and subways. The housing authority, still a disaster. Overall housing costs, high. The city's huge public school system, in many ways segregated. How do we make the competitive high schools and gifted programs more diverse? What role should the city have in fixing the decrepit subways? The list goes on and on. So what's on the de Blasio agenda and what should be his priorities? Former City Council Speaker Christine Quinn remains with us for the program. What do you think? I mean, he is, in my experience, the first progressive mayor of this city with money. We had John Lindsay, we had David Dinkins. Bill de Blasio was lucky enough to inherit a reasonably good economy from Mayor Bloomberg.
And me.
And you, yes, forgive me. And also he's inherited some intractable problems that Bloomberg was not able to deal with, whether it was Rikers Island, whether it was the homeless, whether it was subways, whether it was problems with the school system. What should he be doing the next 10 years, 2 years?
Boy, that point of money is so well taken. Because I remember when David Dinkins was mayor, and I remember I was an advocate then talking to him about cuts he was making to housing and the pain in his eyes.
Right.
You know, so it really is.
Here he was, he finally had the chance and he had nothing to spend.
Yeah, which was not his fault.
Right.
So that is really a game changer. Look, the mayor has 2.5 years left or whatever it is. How exciting. He's a lame duck. Can't run for mayor again or whatever. And we don't
So
know.
it doesn't matter who else he offends.
No, go to town. Right, so let's start with homeless, something that I'm very involved with. I run WIN, which is the largest provider of shelter to homeless women and children. 70% of the record high number of people in shelter are families with children. So good for the mayor. He put out Turning the Tides plan, build new shelters. Great. Fearlessly, brazenly, go out and cite them. Go out and cite them. You know, and if that lady who says she's going to burn them down is seen within 100 feet of them holding a match, arrest her. I mean, I'm being a little extreme,
Right.
but you know what I mean? Get it done. 2, the physical buildings are part of the solution to homelessness, but what happens in them? What type of services? What are we focused on? That's critical. The city hasn't. They're being driven by OMB and numbers in what service providers' contracts look like.
Doesn't he have to get those buildings through the city council, though?
Not usually. I mean, usually every building we want to build for shelter is as of right. So you don't. So that's an important point. I think it would be foolish of the city to pick any sites that needed city council approval, and I don't think they will. So 1, get them cited. 2, reevaluate the services we're providing. He's willing to spend more on real estate? Good. Spend more on the services and make them targeted to data that shows what brings people back. We're clearly not preparing them well for independent living. 3, put in aftercare funding. Social workers who are visiting people in their first year of living independently to help them stabilize. 4, finally, and Mayor Bloomberg made this mistake, and Giuliani and Dinkins and Koch finally see homelessness and the city's affordability crisis as 2 sides of the same coin. We don't do that. We have a deputy mayor for housing. We have a deputy mayor for social services. Unite them. The original mayor's affordable housing plan didn't have 1 unit that was affordable to someone who is coming out of shelter.
How would you define affordable in a case like that?
Well, when I said affordable to somebody coming out of shelter. So you need to make sure they are rents that landlords, one, who will take the vouchers that exist. We have people in shelter who exit shelter and go back to family who have a voucher but can't find a landlord to take it. 2, they have to be set up in a way where landlords are going to take the vouchers. 3, right, you have to make sure the rents are low enough and the voucher's high enough. Right now, a voucher for a family of 4 will get you an apartment that costs $1,551, $1,500. There are practically 0 apartments for a family of 4 where that is going to happen. So let's be realistic and let's be honest about affordable for what and whom. And if you want to reduce the homeless crisis, it's getting people out, keeping them out, and that means they need to be prepared for independent living, but there needs to be housing that they can afford at jobs which might be minimum wage or just slightly above.
Speaking of being realistic, we are going to replace Rikers with 4 little jails or smaller jails. How do we know they are going to be so much better, number one? Number 2, what should we put on Rikers instead?
Well, first of all, I want to applaud the mayor and Speaker Johnson in coming forward with identifying the legal ability to say we're never putting a jail back on Rikers. Mm-hmm. That is a great thing and a good power, and hooray to the staff member who figured out you could do that. So not that again. What we should put there, I don't know. It's a big question, and it's a question I'd love to see New Yorkers participate in the answer of, right? What do we need? And then whatever you put there, it's a super isolated place because it's been a prison. We need to work on the transportation issues. Smaller jails, I believe, are going to work because look at Rikers. It was enormous. It was sprawling. We've lost the concept of rehabilitation as part of our prison and jail system, in part because we let them get so large because of bad criminal justice policy. Smaller will give us the opportunity to focus more individually on inmates, but also on kind of clusters of folks, set up programs around the challenges they had or are having. Also, Rikers is old. Mm-hmm. Just having new physical structures will be different and will be better and less dehumanizing to the people who are being held there.
And very quickly, if he could do one thing to improve the school system, what would it be?
Pay teachers more. Get more social workers into the school, because schools are no longer just, reading, writing, arithmetic. You have to deal with the challenges of society and the challenges of poverty and how that wreaks havoc in school. So teachers need social workers. They need guidance counselors. They need more after-school programming. Let's invest more in the schools, soup to nuts.
Thank you for joining us, Christine Quinn, and I will add my thoughts on CODA coming up next. Predicting population growth is a fool's errand. The farther in the future you project, the more foolish you're likely to look. If that's true for the overall population, imagine trying to predict the number of prison inmates. In the 1970s, the number of prisoners housed on Rikers Island dropped by half. Mayor Koch hoped to close Rikers and replace it with 4 borough-based jails. But he was thwarted by Albany and by not in my backyard resistance. In the 1980s, city officials were stunned when the Rikers population tripled, in large part because of a completely unanticipated import from the West Coast called crack cocaine. Rikers is a hellhole for inmates and for guards. Nobody argues in its defense. But city officials have yet to fully explain why 4 little Rikers in each borough, except Staten Island, with similar inmates and guards to what we've got now, will be so much better. The city originally said it could close Rikers by 2026 because the inmate population will have declined by then to 5,500. Then it guesstimated only 4,000. Neighbors still objected that the replacement jails were too tall, so the city lopped off 100 or more feet from the height of each proposed building to accommodate the community. To do so meant having to again lower the estimate of inmate population, this time from 4,000 to 3,300. That would be the lowest since 1920s, when the city had 2 million fewer people. This isn't mathematical statistical modeling. These are political calculations. If only reducing crime were that simple. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.